Greetings, fellow fetid failures. 'Tis I, the Venerable Zippy, with another video, this time on something I'm a little more familiar with. Let's get straight on into it with a now customary semi-related detour. So, there is a film called Back to the Future, right? Which is very good. Essentially, there's this guy called Marty and a doctor, not played by Tom Baker, which is always a letdown. They meet up and find a DeLorean, the particular Irish car that's famous for its time travel antics. They get in this car and travel to the past and meet this woman and another dude and this guy called Brute, and their antics and some skullduggery and maybe even a dog. Anyway, they end up doing something, and when they return to the present, something isn't how it should be because they changed the past. Look, I'll come clean. I've never watched the film and can't be bothered to look it up, but at some point, the timeline changes because Marty did something in the past. As you are probably all very familiar, this is known as the butterfly effect, small events that depending on the decision or action will affect the future in noticeable, long-lasting or interesting ways, and often all three. One small act can change many things in the future for better or worse. This creates a problem for historians, of which I am not one, because these events do not happen in an isolated environment. Also, we can only theorise what otherwise would have happened, with no way of accurately seeing the results. When these events have happened in a military environment, usually the big decisions made are actually quite good, despite many people arguing otherwise. Many times a bad decision was made, it was more often that the opponent just made a better one and the decision was not lightly taken. As a result, I don't often consider many military decisions to be stupid, but outplayed, as most of the times, though much thought was taken throughout these decisions, they had to be made quickly without much planning. That being said, this all made me think. Have there ever been any single decisions that were obviously incorrect, even when they were made, that was bad at the time and had long-lasting consequences? Furthermore, would the other option change the outcome so significantly that history might have been slightly different, in an actual noticeable, tangible way, that we would have never even heard of the original story, proving just how bad the initial decision was? I had a think, and I think I can answer that as I have thought of a few examples. Today though, I will only be sharing one of them with you. To highlight just how ludicrous the outcome of this decision was, let's start at the climax of the stupidity. Not the end, but at the point at which the brown and sticky proverbial hit the fan in a major way. We embark on our journey in 1918, the act of during the conflict in Europe, World War I trench warfare style, the most interesting and awful style. The rowdy former colonials have come over to France and have just started fighting against the might of the German Empire, and something is wrong with their gear. To be fair, everyone had gear issues, but this one piece of equipment was noticeably bad, and boy is it a terrible one. It was so bad, in fact, I have seen people insinuate that America has tried to remove any knowledge of this piece of gear from recorded history the moment the Yanks started landing back in the land of the free. So, quiz time. This decision that made many young Americans throw away their piece of kit in the trenches in 1918. When do you think that decision was made? I'll give you a second. Wrong. It was made 32 years prior. In 1886. In France. In order to get the ball rolling, we need to explain the global situation in the world in 1884, 2 years before this particular decision was made. As a general rule, colonialism. Heaps of it. The European powers were expanding their influence across the globe at a terrifying rate, and the Western technological advantage of the Europeans was giving them quite the advantage over everyone not from the shores of the North Atlantic. Britain had basically won the game of overseas expansion, but there was one continent it had yet to heavily colonize: Africa. Late in 1884, the Berlin Conference happened, and the European powers had to publicly declare what their intentions were with their neighbouring continent, so that there were at least some chance of reducing a conflict by telling everybody where you were going to go and when. Surprisingly, this democratic approach to conquest did actually help a little, as now everybody knew who else would be eyeing up their ambitions, and helped lay the groundwork for negotiation rather than full-scale war. After this conference, the African people's fate was sealed and the Europeans decided to democratically annex their lands. The treaty wasn't until February on 1885, but the wheels were in motion. This, however, did lay the foundations to who opposed who, and many European neighbours had neighbouring ambitions, so there was always the fear that war may break out in Europe. Outside of Africa and Europe, America was colonising the west of North America. But other than some Pacific holdings, they just wanted to be isolationist. Being a mixing bowl of cultures from Europe, it didn't want to get involved and make any enemies, so they tended to stay to themselves and try to industrialise. They were only just out of the incredibly bloody civil war, so there was a good number of people who didn't want to risk any fighting on someone else's France and repeat the carnage they had just all been through. Now, let's focus in on France, where our story starts. They had recently been absolutely brutalised in the Second Franco-Prussian War, a war that was so heavily one-sided that it only lasted 6 months. It went so badly that the French leader, Napoleon III, yes, he was the nephew of you-know-who, was forced to surrender in an incredibly humiliating way. France became a republic for the third time in less than 100 years, and around 700,000 Frenchmen were dead out of about 2 million total French combatants during the war. To add insult to injury, Otto von Bismarck formally announced the formation of Imperial Germany, formalising the Germanic nations into a single country following the war, overnight making Germany the most powerful nation in mainland Europe, which included Alsace-Lorraine, the region just ceded to Prussia following the defeat. Other than that, on France's other borders, Italy had formally unified in 1861, meaning France had a second powerful neighbour in the south. Spain wasn't on the best terms either, as the French had invaded during the original Napoleon's conquesting, which was still very much in recent memory for a lot of the elderly. And to their north, over the sea, was the British Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet to have ever existed up to that point, meaning a righteous and long overdue British invasion could not be ruled out. All in all, France was in a pretty dire situation.
I'm in danger!
Now we know where we are in the world, let's have a look at the gun situation. Yes, this is a gun video, which is my favourite topic, but trust me, this story is interesting, so just stick with it. Gun technology had really exploded around this time. The main thing you need to know for now is that everybody was using black powder firearms in one flavour or another. Black powder being the stuff in your everyday standard fireworks that we're all familiar with. Black powder, which is also just called gunpowder, has a number of drawbacks that had really bottlenecked firearm advancement. But in 1884, that all changed when a man called Paul Vuilleux made a little discovery. Paul was employed at, give me strength, Laboratoire Central de Poudre et Salpeter, or the Central Powder and Saltpeter Laboratories, the manufacturers and chemists behind France's gunpowder production, and he were a very clever lad, one of the bestest. Through his work, he developed smokeless powder, a type of gunpowder that, gets this, doesn't produce much smoke at all. Should really have called it the nearly smokeless powder, but frankly, that's the French always taking liberties with everything. In short, this was absolutely revolutionary. The leap between black powder and smokeless powder changes the firearm game significantly. Let me explain. Black powder produces a huge cloud of black smoke. Shocker. Smokeless powder doesn't, meaning you can see once you shoot. Pre-1880s battlefields had men wearing bright uniforms, but you couldn't see the bastards because of the huge plumes of smoke that were being released every time they fired, and therefore you could not see what you were shooting at either. In addition, you couldn't sneak around the battlefield because the moment you fired a single volley, you would be located as your unit would be surrounded in a thick cloud of black smoke. You didn't have this issue with smokeless powder. Black powder basically has a maximum velocity. That is an astronomic oversimplification, and if you look into it, it's not true either. But for the sake of simplification, let's go with it. It basically means that the only way to make a projectile more dangerous is to make the projectile bigger. If velocity is fixed, and again that's not entirely true, the only way to increase the energy of the round is to increase its size, meaning you have big bullets. Smokeless powder has a much higher velocity capacity, meaning that you can have smaller projectiles and cartridges achieve the same power. Not only that, but the range a projectile has is very closely related to its velocity. So as smokeless powder has a higher velocity, the projectiles travel much faster and have a much longer range as a result. The really big issue, however, and it was the absolute bane of military engineers everywhere, is that black powder is filthy. Black powder, upon ignition, creates a gas. the burning is incomplete and it leaves behind a black sticky residue. A lot of this residue will fly out the barrel, no problem, but some of it sticks to the inside of the barrel, and after multiple rounds, it builds up. This residue starts to squeeze subsequent projectiles and slows them down, or even affect their ballistics. This is a known issue, and cleaning your rifle during combat was very common, as in order to keep your gun accurate, you need to rid yourself of the gunk. Smokeless powder has no residue, which means the gun can just keep firing. Tiny aside here, this is the reason black powder machine guns don't exist at this point in time. The residue builds up quickly and just stops them from working. Paul Mauser was attempting to make machine guns in the 1870s, but couldn't make one that worked due to the residue problem. The invention of smokeless powder by Monsieur makes all black powder firearms obsolete overnight, and the French know it. Naturally, France went all hush on this new invention as they realised they had the edge in the arms race that would inevitably follow. This led to a lot of secret research being done behind the scenes, with only a select few outside of the programme being granted the luxury of knowing the insight as to this new development. It should be noted that smokeless powder in many forms was being experimented on by many of the European nations, not just France, but the French were the first to get it to work reliably and be made easily. Another side note is it was originally called white powder. In the aftermath of this development, the French arsenals worked to develop the bullets that would become the new standard of the French rifle. The decision was made to take some time and do this whole thing right. They know that if they spent some time making this thing work properly and tried to figure out how best to make this new firearm, it would become the best rifle in the world and stay that way for a long time. They did not want to rush this development. A man named Lebel, the gun nerds have just perked up and know where this is going, was on the team working to develop the new projectile, and by the end of 1885 they had sort of done so, roughly figuring out the best projectile for this new powder was approximately an 8mm diameter round-tipped one, but beyond that they didn't really have a clue. I'm very sorry, but we're at the point in the story where the French accent is going to be rolled out a lot from here on in. Up until this point in the story, the French Minister of War was a man named Jean-Baptiste Campagnon, who was very smart for a French militaryman, probably, and he wanted to proceed with the development in a way that would make it the best rifle ever and would stay that way for as long as possible. This is a smart move. Campagnon did not stay at his job very long and essentially was promoted. The man they replaced him with, however, was a bloke called Georges Boulanger. I believe it's supposed to be pronounced Georges Boulanger, but frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. This half-French, half-Welsh general was generally considered very brave, but he was wounded a lot, so perhaps you could argue he was very brash. He was a very well-respected man amongst his countrymen, as he basically created the well-known belief of revanchism. In this particular case, the belief of taking back lost territory as a result of losing Alsace-Lorraine in the Second Franco-Prussian War. This hasty attitude meant that when he became the Minister of War, he became the man to whom all military affairs fell to. As a result, he was told about the new smokeless powder. He reviewed the documents, and he did something that would quite possibly kill thousands of French soldiers.
I've cocked up. I know I've cocked up.
It is now January of 1886, and Boulanger is sat at his desk and pens a letter to the design team behind the new rifle. Now, he had two options. He could either do the smart thing and continue developing the bullet first, get that right, and develop a brilliant rifle to suit. Or he could not do that. The letter effectively says, don't do a French accent, 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 don't do a French accent. Bonjour, mes amis. Le designing of a new and wonderful rifle with the new smokeless powder into marble. Je suis believe in you that you will get me the new rifle and that it will be amazing, and the best thing in the world, and so that we may fight the Germans and retake our land. I have every confidence in you to achieve this, and together we will make our great and not at all disgusting nation the best country in the universe by your work. By the way, I want this project completed by May of this year. Get to it or else kisses kisses. Needless to say, this was the wrong decision. The design team looked at this timeline and looked at the calendar in front of them. They had 5 months. They had only developed the projectile. They had not even finished that. Not even the whole cartridge. Croissants flew across the room as panic filled the air. Men with outrageous facial hair began to wiggle their moustaches in despair. I like to believe that the daily company brunch outing to the local patisserie was postponed for a few minutes as the realization of this task dawned on them. They had to make a rifle basically from scratch, with brand spanking new technology within 5 months. This decision had effectively condemned the rifle to work shoddily at best, downright dangerous or even inoperable at worst. And they knew it. If it isn't clear by now, this new rifle was doomed to fail because of this decision. The chance of having a good rifle by the end of it was being ruined so that France could momentarily have the best gun in the world and have Boulanger's name pinned across the world as being the first to do so. But it was inevitable that it would only be a year or two before a completely new gun, built from the ground up, would become better, and that is truly horrific to think about. It dawned on the engineers that the only way this deadline would be met would be to adapt another rifle for a new hastily developed cartridge. But that wouldn't quite work out as planned. First, they needed to find a gun to adapt, which fortunately didn't take long to source. It turns out that the Navy had adopted the Kropatschek system, an Austro-Hungarian design which had an underbarreled tube magazine. One of the requirements the design team had decided upon was a magazine of some sort, which was an ideal design to start with. What made it even better was the fact that the army had adopted it in 1885, meaning that tooling was already in production to create a new gun. So once designed, a little bit of rejigging and it now enters military service almost immediately. The design team basically split up and started working independently from each other, using the Kropatschek system as its base design, and relatively little was changed other than the bolt and the barrel. They essentially wanted a new gun that worked, so nothing was changed if it didn't need to be. The big problem this created was the cartridge. When testing the projectile, they were using Gras cartridges, the Gras being the rifle in service with the army up until 1885. When it turns out that the gun needs to be ready sharpish, they literally copy the test cartridges, making them look a little nicer, and hey presto, new 8mm projectile in Gras brass. This was a total kludge and sealed the fate for the effectiveness of anything other than this first rifle having to use this cartridge. The idea was good. A flat-firing, long-range smokeless powder bullet, travelling incredibly fast with good accuracy, was a winner. But the cartridge is wide, and even though it won't cause too many problems in this new rifle, it will down the line, as we shall see. At any rate, the cartridge was named after the previously mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Nicolas Lebel, who had designed the projectile and become infamous as the 8mm Lebel, the first smokeless powder cartridge in military service. By some absolutely incomprehensible miracle, the rifle was completed in time and adopted. In 1887, it entered service as the Fusil Model 1886, or as we like to say in the King's English, Lebel Rifle Model of 1886, or just Lebel to its friends, which to be fair, there were not that many of. Don't get me wrong, the moment this thing was revealed on the world stage, everyone's jimmies were rustled. The major European powers saw that this gun had just made every other firearm around the world obsolete. Not obsolescent, but completely obsolete, and scrambled to come up with something better. But for that single moment, that single beautiful French moment, Boulanger's military was the envy of the world.
That doesn't work. Thanks awfully.
Right, let's set the record straight. The rifle wasn't very good. It was a Frankenstein of ideas born out of necessity because of the self-imposed deadline. I have no sympathies for that, but the cartridge is really disgusting. The issue is that the hurry to make this cartridge made it totally unsuitable for what smokeless powder now allowed firearms to do. If you look at the cartridge, it looks really weird. All of the nations that developed smokeless cartridges made much better attempts between the years 1888 and 1895. The main issue is that the rifle uses a tube magazine, and even though the Lebel holds 8 cartridges, which is more than the average when compared to other designs at the time, it wasn't safe or fast to load. The cartridges were lined up tip to primer. Under spring pressure, one jolt and they could detonate as the bullet tip from one cartridge hits the primer of the cartridge in front. Because of this, the brass was given a rim at the base and a huge taper of 20 degrees, which was also inherited from that Gras cartridge it was originally designed from, with a ridge being put in the base to help hold the rounds in place, being added at a later date. The combination of the large brass, the wide rim, and the extreme taper made it a nightmare to work with, but it was now in service with the French military, and they couldn't just get rid of it. Many nations did have rimmed cartridges, Britain and Russia being the obvious ones, but the rounds were smaller and straighter, meaning they would much more easily work in other designs. Say, box magazines, for example, which is really difficult with 8mm Lebel. The situation was so bad, in fact, that in 1888, 1 year after the Lebel was released, the German 8mm Gewehr commission rifle was released and was decidedly better, which should tell you how bad the Lebel was if it was outclassed by something that literally had the name commission rifle. Commissions are made when nobody wants to take the blame for a failure and to save your career. This rifle had serious problems, but it was just much better. It also gave us the excellent 8mm Mauser cartridge, so the French cartridge was already obsolete 1 year after its announcement. Over the following years, Austro-Hungarian Mannlicher rifles, Russian Mosin Nagants, British Enfields and Italian Carcanos all entered service, and for reasons that don't really matter in this video, were all much superior to the French equivalent. If you haven't gotten the message, 8mm Lebel had condemned this rifle to a horrible, unceremonious and inane death. The French knew it, and they wanted to change it, but things don't often go your way when you make a mistake. You see, World War I was bound to happen. No one knew when, where, or who would be on your side. As a result, as international crises came and resolved, every time France considered replacing the cartridge, they got too scared to do so, and gurned painfully as they kept the bullets they so hated. They knew that changing your main cartridge during, or even just before war, is a problem waiting to happen. France knows that they have messed up. They decide that rather than updating the 8mm Lebel rifle, which has currently weaseled its way into every aspect of the French military, they decide to instead update the rifle itself and just try and come up with something a little bit better. They come up with the rifle known as the Berthier. It's essentially a better rifle, even though it does still have a lot of shortcomings and is one of the worst rifles in the great conflict that is about to erupt in Europe. But France has a brand new rifle that functionally is better than what they had, and helps get rid of some of the shortcomings of the Lebel. Fantastic! At that point, some Bosnians shot an Austrian, which meant Serbia was attacked, who in turn called in Russia, and blah 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 blah, World War I done happened. France at this point had a number of machine guns in 8mm Lebel, the Hotchkiss in multiple forms, the astonishingly complicated Saint-Étienne, and even some of the truly excellent and sexy Vickers guns. I love you, Vickers gun. Most of the guns, with the exception of the Vickers, and some other small production machine guns, used 20 to 30 round feed strips because the Lebel cartridge couldn't realistically be used in box magazines because of the wide brass, and this meant that the French used machine guns were very difficult to reload, and as a result, a lot of gunners were killed and lines were captured due to this damnable cartridge. The projectile was at this point getting men killed in the field. At this point, the Frog search for a light machine gun entered full swing. The idea that a smaller portable machine gun that could easily relocate around the battlefield was incredibly highly requested. If you have a portable machine gun for assaults, you need it to be able to reload quite quickly, and the feed strips are not capable of that. France didn't want multiple cartridges in their supply lines. They had already purchased multiple Vickers guns in 303 British, and that was proving to be difficult enough to get to the front, so the new gun had to be box magazine fed in 8mm Lebel. Fortunately, there was a man who had already been working on that for quite some time.
I'm an inventor.
Oh, you're an inventor.
Yes, I am.
What have you invented?
A lot of things.
Like?
Like a lot of things. Like things that you've heard of.
Like?
Everybody say hello to Jacques-Louis Henri Chauchot, who I often refer to as Louis, because it's a funny name. Before we continue with this, I need to sidetrack really quickly and talk about something I discovered about this man while I was looking for some odd information about Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite. Somehow, and I don't remember why it was, but hey, it happened. It turns out Louis was genuinely how he introduced himself, was a good swordsman due to him being an officer in the French army, and actually was a referee at the 1900 Paris Olympic Summer Games, at men's épée, or fencing to you uncultured ruffians. I am seeing mixed info on this, but he may have even refereed the final. The reason I bring this up is that upon reading upon the event, it turns out there are 104 entrants in this particular event, 91 of them being French, with the gold medal winner being, you guessed it, Cuban. Don't know why I found that funny, but I did. It's just a fun little story that made me chuckle, and I don't really think I'll ever get another opportunity to bring that up. Anyway, Louis was an avid inventor, and he had been working on a light machine gun since before the war. He had a shed which he used to fire his designs in pretty much around the clock, which will become important later on. I don't know what foreshadowing smells like, but I can currently smell it. He was working on a light machine gun that could be mounted to an aircraft, which is weirdly how the Lewis gun, the American-designed British-adopted light machine gun of the war, also started out. Because of the requirements not to have belts of ammo flopping about, machine guns in planes needed to be contained, and a box magazine was originally how you achieved that. Mr. Shosho, the man with the marvellously whimsical name, had developed a 20-round box magazine for the 8mm Lebel cartridge somehow, and stuck it to the top of the gun for ease of access in a plane. Now, let me explain, because I feel I need to. The magazine is a semicircle. Now that we've done basic geometry, let me explain why. This is because the round has that 20-degree taper to it, like I kept mentioning earlier. I keep repeating it, but it's worth saying again. The Lebel cartridge was rushed and as a result caused countless problems, this being one of them. The taper also meant that the magazine spring had issues feeding the gun. Aptly named the Shosho, this abomination was only really loaded to 18 rounds to compensate for that failure. Say it with me, the cartridge had problems. What I absolutely need to make clear here, and if you only remember one bit from this section, it's this. The Shosho was essentially designed in a way to work with 8mm Lebel. Other machine guns had many problems with it and simply wouldn't work. The brilliance of this design, and it was brilliant, is that it somehow worked. Not that it was in fact any good, but it was designed to work with a bad cartridge. In light of this, Louis changed this design to have the magazine attached to the bottom of the machine gun, and voila, you have a ground portable machine gun for the grunts to gratuitously gun Germans. With full-scale production beginning at very late 1915, the Shosho CSRG model of 1915 became the French light machine gun of World War I. It was cheap to make, easy to make, and gave the average peasant enough firepower to level the Germans' advantage on the battlefield. Please note, this is not a good gun. The sights are offset, so you have to sit off to the left to get a sight picture, even though it's very terrible to begin with. The gun fired at about 240 rounds a minute, which is under half the rate of most comparable guns. The gun tended to overheat, and the long recoil system it utilised meant that it was very difficult to shoot accurately. All this made it bad, but it would be irresponsible to mention that the ammo that it used, our friend 8mm Lebel, which as we now know, is not ideal. To add yet more insult to injury, in addition to this, the magazine used in the Shosho was bad. Really bad. Like going on a family holiday to Pompeii in October of 79 AD bad. It was made of incredibly thin metal, which was easily broken, and as mentioned earlier, the springs had issues due to the required curve in the magazine to cope with the Lebel cartridge. In addition to that, the other thing about the magazine was that the majority of them had these gaps in the sides. This was used to allow a second man, a loader, to see when the gun was running out of ammo, which, seeing as this gun used 20-round magazines, at best, was immediately after being reloaded, and prepare a new magazine for loading. It should be mentioned that the cuts were initially designed to assist in loading magazines, but both points are incredibly valid here. Quick quiz time. When you think of the Great War, what three things do you think of? Trenches, dreadnoughts, the Red Baron, the Matahari perhaps? What about that one photo of that most evil man to have ever existed? Well, there is an extremely high chance that the word mud popped into your small, smooth brain. Can you see the problem with the conditions of World War I and the magazine with holes in it? Yeah, it was a silly decision. Louis dropped the ball there, and as a result, mags became full of mud and failed to feed. The Shosho was decent because they were churned out of France at light speed, but they were not good guns. That was the only redeeming quality. The reason they were made that way is largely due to the fact that 8mm Lebel was a bastard of a cartridge. The gun was made to suit the ammo, and as a result was heavily compromised from the start. The original decision to go ahead and speed up the production of the development of the Lebel rifle has a direct correlation with the problems of this gun. The ammo developed for the rifle was bad, the knock-on effects followed it through into the Great War and into this machine gun. Spectacular! Wait, hang on. We spent a lot of time talking about France, but we started talking about the Americans' diabolical equipment. So what's the connection?
Yeah, so
The biscuit industry is one of the hardest industries to break into. That and arms.
arms dealing, biscuits dealing.
Would you invest in arms?
My mother was in arms dealing. She sold swords.
Across the pond that us Europeans are so thankful exists, there's this little nation called America, and you never hear about them as the Americans that inhabit this land are very quiet, shy, and try their best to stay out of the limelight at all costs. During the Great War, the US didn't really want to be involved. There were many immigrants across Europe, and the German communities sided with the Germans. The British communities sided with the British, and the Balkan communities didn't know who they wanted to fight because the Balkans appeared on both sides of the conflict. It really is a surprise that they didn't all chip in together, buy a boat, arrive in Croatia, and create a third faction independent from the others, determined to take on anyone they could find from Budapest to Athens just for old time's sake. But isolation was the name of the game for the United States in general. Whilst independent, the US was selling guns to anyone with a couple of dollars lying about, and they became very wealthy. The thing they failed to see is that they could potentially be dragged into a war kicking and screaming, but seeing as the cultures in the country were so massively divided, they just sat back and counted the bucks as they cashed in. To the surprise of Americans everywhere, when the US did enter the war on the side of the Entente Cordiale, because of World War II you may know them as the Allies, they joined with a woefully equipped army. The US Armed Forces consisted of just over 100,000 men, which, to put it into perspective, was less than Serbia at that same time, which was basically completely occupied by Austria-Hungary, meaning the US had a smaller army than a minor nation who no longer had a state to call home. Germany had 2 million men in the field, and almost all of them now had experience in combat. The land of the free needed to expand its capabilities. For a country that was arming literally everybody in the world, they didn't really have any idea that they may need guns too, and neglected their own personal needs. As a result, the army was given what little supply of Springfield 1903 rifles they had, and ended up adopting British pattern 14 rifles under the name Model 1917, which was made from a production line the British had cancelled the contract for because it was taking too long. There was therefore a large factory ready to make rifles for a major warring nation. Just start up production and arm the doughboys with them. Easy. The 1917 went on to become the most common US rifle of the war, despite people saying the 1903 was the primary firearm. This, however, didn't solve the other issue the US had, which was artillery and machine gun shortages. Again, they did have some, but to all intents and purposes, they didn't have enough to make an impact. The decision was made, ship the doughboys out, and literally buy stuff from the Entente when in Europe, which they did, with the money the Europeans were paying America with for the same equipment. Look, this entire war is really silly. I don't know if you picked up on this. Oh, I love World War I. When in France, the US military started training for war and buying arms at an alarming rate. They quickly found some artillery, but the machine guns were proving to be more elusive. They had two offers. Either buy the Lewis gun from the British. The Lewis gun was a brilliant device, if a bit heavy and expensive, or shows from France, which, as we have discussed, was cheap and easy to make and available in the thousands immediately, but generally a little bit rubbish. They opted for the show. There's a couple of reasons for this, mainly due to political pressure, but also because they just wanted as many machine guns as possible. But things are now falling into place. The US proceeds to use the show in combat for the foreseeable future. They know some crackpot genius named their Lord and Saviour John Moses Browning Jr. was cooking up some wild machine gun called the BAR, or the Browning Automatic Rifle, but the Yanks wanted to taste the fire and get stuck in immediately before it was completed, so the French machine gun was the must-buy product of the season. And the troops hated it for all the reasons we've already discussed. The ammo immediately became an issue. The use of the 30-06 US cartridge in their rifles meant that they wanted to use that for their machine guns too, not 8mm Lebel. So orders were made with Gladiator and Sidarm factories in France to make the show machine guns in the US projectile of choice. This in theory gets rid of many of the issues of the show, so it went into production. The 30-06 cartridge is a much straighter cartridge, and that means that you didn't have to have some bendy magazine, which helped the spring a bit and also meant that you could reload the magazine without the use of all 7 of your hands. The gun still got hot, but at least it would function up until that point. Well, nearly. The production was rushed, and as a result, the new design had a really interesting new set of problems. That was all despite the fact they were using a better cartridge than 8mm Lebel. The improved gun is actually a lot worse. We'll start with the big one. The magazine was way worse somehow. The magazine was originally very bendy in the show thanks to that taper on the ammo we've already talked about, which disappears with 30-06, meaning the magazine is very tall, which is too tall to make in a 20-round magazine or it would stick into the ground. So you now only have a max of 16 rounds. Although downloading it to 14 rounds was extremely common owing to the still problematic spring in the mechanism, not because it's bendy anymore, but because it was just not very good. This meant that it had a much larger underside when loaded, making reloading difficult. especially when paired with the main modification to the rifle itself, where the magazine well that protruded at the bottom of the gun, meaning that maneuvering the magazine to slot it into the gun was damn near impossible without good training, which didn't arrive. To make things worse, the magazine was made to a much more inferior quality. The French Shocho magazines were only weak at the very least. The American magazines were so fragile that you could crush the things just by holding them ready to load. The metal was so thin that even responsible handling of them made their potential operability questionable. I cannot find any reason as to why these magazines were so thin. You can force it to crumble by simply wafting your hand in its general direction. I can only assume it was a cost-cutting measure. These changes were absolutely disastrous for the brave lads that had the unfortunate experience of having to use these things. There are accounts from American gunners who lament their existence with them, and many just wishing they could drop the damn things in favour of something else they found on the battlefield. It is probably fair to come to the conclusion that the problems with these things had a negative effect on the combat capabilities of the AEF, as machine gun suppressive fire had noticeable effects in combat, and if your machine gun section is down because it is either overheated, malfunctioned, or maybe been tossed aside in some rare cases, then perhaps it's not a stretch to claim that either directly or indirectly, the US Shocho likely cost an unreasonable number of young Americans' lives in the fields of northern France. The Shocho was designed to work in 8mm Lebel, and the magazine was designed to allow that. The moment you change the magazine so dramatically to work with something else, you need to have a good quality magazine or the terrible gun's overall package becomes worse. All of these problems occurred as they didn't want to use 8mm Lebel, which is fine, but they didn't bother putting in proper effort into the 30-06 conversion and claimed that the entire reason for this whole debacle was because of supply lines, because God forbid you have to find a French rifle cartridge in France of all places. Ultimately, the US Shocho and its failed adaptation was doomed to be remembered as a bad decision in the US arms purchasing history, and you can find very little in the way of proof that they ever saw service by official means. We have conversations with the doughboys who talk about them, a handful of photos, and the guns themselves, but the US government appears to have tried to erase their memory over the years following the America's first late arrival to a world war. The US Shocho story ends here, and as such we conclude. Take it away, Zippy.
Do I make myself clear?
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
Ah yes, we have gotten to the end of our story so far. A long tale of ebbs and flows, meandering, and surprisingly little mention of Martel's XO Cognac, which is delicious and you should buy some immediately. Still not sponsored, by the way, after my pleas from last week. Sad, sad cry. But I started off by asking how a decision made in 1886 resulted in the worst American firearm of World War I. And now you know. Hello, post-production Zippy here, and I'm quite ill, so this is going to be pretty rough. Essentially, the last bit I recorded was going to be far too long, so here's the real condensed version of it. You've got a new thing, you've got smokeless powder, they want to make it brilliant, but then Boulanger comes along and says, no, I want it really fast. So then the cartridge kind of gets messed around with because they don't make something purpose-built, they now make something that's an adaptation of something else. This has got some major drawbacks because of the changes that smokeless powder allows you to have. This then creates the 8mm Lebel cartridge, which is in turn used in the 8mm Lebel model of 1886. They want to get rid of it because they understand the shortcomings of it, but then World War I happens and they get stuck with it. At this time, they need a light machine gun, and a light machine gun is made that can utilize it, but it's not very good because of a lot of the drawbacks of the cartridge. Then the Americans show up. They start buying Shochos because they don't have a light machine gun of their own. It turns out that then converting it into their own cartridge creates new problems that weren't foreseen because the 30-06 cartridge is superior to 8mm Lebel. This in turn means that America has a terrible, terrible light machine gun. It's still functional and still works as a light machine gun, but it is by far the worst one that's currently in service that is in any large number. This creates a real problem where Americans start dying. If it wasn't for the fact that the initial cartridge was rushed, this probably wouldn't have been the case. Both countries probably would have ended up with something that was a lot more akin to the BAR or the Lewis gun later on down the line. This is how that one decision to rush the cartridge through development, to just get something out there and make it the best thing possible for the time, meant that further down the line, everything was just a big crap. The development process went through so many hoops to keep the 8mm Lebel cartridge working that it effectively ended up creating just as many issues. The cartridge was 11mm gras brass next down to 8mm. That gave the round some seriously odd dimensions and happened to make the design slightly very terrible. It simply wasn't going to work well in anything reliably, and when it's your standard cartridge in a war, everything now revolves around that round. The French needed a gun that could work with it, and the Shosho just about could. The Americans then ruined, and you can argue with this all you want, an average at best design by swapping to a better cartridge, but the bad gun now had even worse magazines to work with, and it failed in the field with spectacularly bad results. And that's the end of the tale. Except it isn't. It's the end for today, but if you want some further reading, let me say that 8mm Lebel sticks around in French service until the end of World War II. But even then, they continued production into the 1960s for use in the Hotchkiss machine guns. And for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to petition to the King to knight the 8x50 Rims Lebel cartridge for doing the one thing us Brits love more than anything else: irritating the neighbours from hell across the channel for nigh on 80 years. God bless you, Baldy. God bless you.
There's just one other thing, sir.
What's that?
I'll explain it to you in a minute.
Thank you very much for watching. Just a couple of notes to round this off. This is a little something I have thought about for a few years now, and how differently things would have been if it wasn't for the French Minister of War change back in 1886. I like the story, and hopefully I made a bit of gun talk a little more interesting, even if you don't care for the topic generally. I have a few more like this I can do, a couple more famous stories, but I think they're all pretty interesting. It's worth noting that some people claim the link in this is tenuous, but honestly the Shosho was terrible because of the ammunition constraints, and the American decision to adopt it is understandable, but bad, and that's why I like this story and blame it all on the decision which started it all. This video was made with the unknowing and unwilling support of two of my favourite YouTube channels and their content creators, Ian McCullum of Forgotten Weapons and Matthias and May of CN Arsenal, both of whom have fantastic videos on everything I have mentioned here, and have done such a good video series documenting this, I really don't need to go anywhere else. Ian is basically the go-to source on all things frog these days, so I'm in good hands, I believe. So go subscribe to them if you haven't, which is unlikely if you're watching this to start off with, but they are amazingly insightful channels if you haven't come across them before. Just like my first video, I will have gotten things wrong, missed things out, stood on a cat, all the things that an amateur like me is likely to do, so do say so in the comments. I will compile a list of inaccuracies and list them in a pinned comment. And finally, I would usually end off by saying thank you. Thank you, anyway. But this is a video about the most tragic, gruesome and depressing war in human history. So I think we should finish off with a roundup of two of the names I mentioned earlier to lighten the mood a bit before I go away and leave you alone for the night. Louis Shosho had spent years of his life developing firearms after spending a lot of time on the battlefield. After the Shosho was in service, he continued trying to develop the next iteration of the gun in his shed in the factory in which he was employed, constantly shooting it to test it whenever he was working on it. Only this shed had no ventilation, and he had been doing so since at least 1903. Gunpowder is bad for you, and he was breathing in concentrated amounts of the stuff for possibly up to 14 years. Day in, day out. It turns out foreshadowing smells an awful lot like smokeless powder. Unfortunately, this meant at the age of 54 in Paris on the 5th of September 1917, due to an illness contracted from fume inhalation, never seeing the end of the war he had tried to bring a swift conclusion to with his invention, he died in his bed, surrounded by his family. His machine rifle was not a good design, but in a war where volume of fire and portability was a major factor, despite its shortcomings, overall it definitely helped the French in the defence of their country. After all, the bad machine gun you have is better than the good machine gun you don't have, and that is something to be respected. Jacques-Louis Honoré Chauchot died leaving behind 5 children and his wife, Léonie Eugénie Yvonne Labouré. He is rightfully recognised as a war hero in France, and appears in the lists of the dead combatants of the war due to the respect he so rightfully deserves, giving his life for his country, killed by testing the machine he helped design. The second we will visit is Georges Ernest Boulonier, the man who made the decision that this video was all about, After his appointment as Minister of War, he tried to lead his country to war with Germany to reclaim the lost territories, but ultimately fell on deaf ears. His attempts to become president were quashed, and his heavy-handedness towards the French strikes let down his public image quite dramatically. He nearly caused a war between Germany and France in 1887, but calmer heads prevailed and he was kicked out of the government the following year after an electoral defeat. He went on to become very popular in the following years for advocating to the French people for the reconquest of Alsace-Lorraine, a change in the constitution and a restoration of the French monarchy. But he made many enemies along the way. After this, he was removed from the army. Yes, this all happened while he was in uniform, and things got a little spicy from there. Under the patronage of Prince Napoleon Jeremy Bonaparte, yes, the great-grandson of you-know-who, he attempted to run as a pro-monarchist for the ascension to the throne of the great-grandson of you-know-who, and actually made it to the Chamber of Deputies. Things were going quite well for Boulogne, but then things took a turn for the worst. He lost a small sword duel with another elderly member of the house after Boulogne tried to dismiss Parliament. This happened the following Friday after he tried to dismiss Parliament, where they ended up having a fight where both men ended up taking hits, but Boulogne was hit in the throat and was badly wounded. Despite his pleas to continue, the seconds to the duel agreed that his opponent, Charles Floquet, had won, and Boulogne had lost a lot of his following in shame due to this. The following year, he nearly attempted a coup to take France by force, but decided against it. Recognizing the danger he posed, the government forced him to flee France, at which point he went into exile. In 1891, he secretly returned to France with a pistol, found the grave of his mistress, and shot himself through the temple. He died a pariah in his own country, and is buried with the woman his body landed beside. Boulogne went on to become synonymous with his own idea of revanchism, the idea that national identity is reclaiming lost territory, and as a result is often associated with the Nazis, 1930s Hungary, multiple South American juntas, and more recently, Russia. His legacy has become one of bitterness and a cry for imperialistic ambition, one which dooms nations in a world of democracy and enlightenment. Wait, hang on. None of that was happy at all. That was even more depressing. Oh, fuck.